Okay, it's post-lunch, so the diurnal cycle of the wind here is picking up and hopefully doesn't make any noise in my recording. The last part of this chapter on evolution of human behavior is on the evolution of hominin brain itself. Sorry. We already mentioned that the Neanderthal cranium was bigger than the sapiens, but apparently the neocortex was smaller, so they had inferior ability to think, let's say. Okay. Obviously, brain is now a huge focus of lots of research because they are being used to build robots. The number of robots that are being used for various functions is now huge. Japan was leading that for a while, trying to make as human a robot as possible, including some receptionists and so on. And there are lots of cute videos on YouTube that show what robots can do, like a dog that's trying to open a door and so on and so forth. And now we know how many signals are sent to even do something simple, like I'm talking now, my brain tells my cells that they are dry, they need water. Then even as I'm talking, I'm going to reach for a cup of water, and I know where it is, and I know whether it's made of plastic or glass or something. So the force I use is already calibrated to lifting that particular thing, and then I stop for a minute and take a sip. So all these things are now understood more and more, but still lots of gaps remain. So in that sense, brain has evolved over time, even though we don't always know whether that was affecting behavior. Well, it does, but whether there is a feedback between the brain and behavior and environmental signals and so on. So typically you see these kinds of figures where you have the spinal cord connecting to the brain stem with the cerebellum up here, the entire cerebrum here, including the temporal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, frontal lobe, and the left and right hemispheres. Lots of literature on what it means to have a larger frontal lobe, artistic creation, religiosity, spiritualism, intellectual abilities, mathematical abilities, autism, how it affects social skills but can enhance quantitative skills, and so on and so forth. And these kinds of details are being mapped in terms of how brain controls various things from toes, ankle, knee, hip, and so on to swallowing here, so that the robots can be built to do precisely what we want them to do, either for serving our needs or for doing our chores or helping handicapped people and so on and so forth, right? So what is it that we know about the brain and behavior? Now this is part of the general brain ideas as well. How do different colored brains think, communicate, and act? So there are these ideas of a red brain, green brain, blue brain, and purple brain, and they have certain characteristics of linear, chaotic, intuitive, and relational processing. These need red brain is a linear processing, so it needs clarity to do anything, must be objective, logical, must analyze before taking action and find structure in what is being demanded as a task, whereas green brain, nothing seems connected, must act to understand. It's not like understand and act, but do something and understand it. Needs feedback, sees the big picture, finds alternatives. So there could be an advantage to being chaotic and seeing the big picture, while these may be better as worker bees, these may be better as leaders. I'm just saying in general. Blue brains with intuitive processing, everything is connected. They feel the environment and insightful of the surroundings. They can multitask and be intuitive of others. Purple brain must have information. All data is linked. Needs details. Find system. Must know options. So there is also the idea of Jonathan Haidt, which says the human brain is like a elephant and a rider. So elephant is the emotional part. Let's say the amygdala, which needs motivation, needs a goal, needs pathway to make movements in any direction. Rider, smaller than the elephant but can control the elephant, and rider can be rational but keep rationalizing and not take action, and always seek excuses for not taking action, and so on and so forth. So the idea is, again, coming back to behavior, whether these are inheritable, genetic, and so on. Nonetheless, what we know, the list from the book, here are some of the generally accepted points about hominin brain evolution for the moment without interpretive bias. So there's a lot of literature now on this. You can follow up on your own. Incredibly good books written on the brain, especially from a Harvard faculty who had a stroke and lost part of the brain and slowly trained herself to come back and has learned a lot about how the brain works. There is ideas of brain plasticity and so on and so forth. So here, if the species of Australopithecus and Homo are examined in chronological sequence, saltatory brain enlargement is found to be a prominent aspect of their evolution. So it was a jump, punctuated equilibrium kind of evolution and not a continuous evolution. Brain enlargement is hypermorphic, which means it works at much higher functionality than what a gene would say. Correlated with enlargement of the cranium, and in females of the species, the birth canal. So for the big head to be born, the birth canal had to get bigger. Stereoscopic vision, an upright stance, manipulative skills in terms of hand, not necessarily brain manipulation of other beings, and complex vocalization are other correlates. So we can make lots of sounds, especially, as I mentioned, Chinese language versus Japanese versus English versus other Indian languages, and so on and so forth. Brain enlargement has involved convolution of neocortex and its lamination into layers of neurons. So convolution is basically them working together to produce something more complicated, complex. Neocortical packaging allows for compactness within the limited capacity of the cranium, as well as greater computing power. So the cranium has a certain size, and lots of neurons are fit into it by creating these special folding abilities and layers. What else can I say? Let me leave it there. The neocortex integrates with but can override some lower homeostatic functions like sweating, heart rate, pupil dilation, muscle relaxation, fight and flight response, rest and digest response, and so on and so forth. For example, with meditation, you can try to deal with fight and flight response and replace it with rest and digest or feed and breed kind of response, and so on and so forth. During the development of individuals, learning is correlated with differential establishment of dendritic connections between neurons in the central nervous system, and probably with synaptic facilitation through modification of cell surface receptors for neurotransmitters. So hormones that allow various responses, including fight or flight, reward, love, rest and digest kind of feelings. This means that the microstructure of mature brains differ according to experience, as well as to the underlying adaptability of neural functional anatomy, even in genetically identical twins. So things like post-traumatic stress syndrome, or something that you experienced, a trauma as a child, and so on, can affect brain structure, response, neuronal connections, and how the amygdala has translated the physical experience into an emotional response and so on. Okay, unless children learn how to use the potential of their higher brain functions at the appropriate threshold stages of their development, they may not be able to acquire full potential later on. So this is about this gets complicated because when we say appropriate threshold stages, do you mean education, free, growing up in a free environment, doing exploring on their own, or is formal education important at all? Is it just acquiring talent, expertise, or is it really brain development? And all those kinds of things are complicated. Education in general is also considered a wicked problem, which means people cannot agree on how education should be structured, so we don't know how different educations may affect the brain. And a wicked problem doesn't have a solution, it just has to be resolved, which means it has to be resolved again and again, as has been written in many places. The brain is an adaptable organ in two ways. Even in mature adults, brain damage can be repaired or circumvented. So there is a brain plasticity that you can rewire consciously or through other medical interventions. You can make things work. The adaptability of the brain, in the sense of having multiple modifiable organized functions, allows behavioral adaptability. So this is Lamarckian, in the sense you can learn in your lifetime to adapt behaviorally. Say how to respond to aggressive behavior, how to respond to police shouting at you, how to respond to a teacher, to a father, mother, community, social justice, environmental issues, intrinsic personality versus extrinsic personality, caring more about image and power than relations and environment and so on. Okay, so obviously this is an incredibly complicated and detailed topic with extensive research in all aspects of it. But before we move to the next chapter on human diaspora, we just had to go through these discussions on behavior, brain development, evolution, saltatory, gradual, and so on. And we haven't really answered any questions, but we have raised a lot of interesting questions and possibilities, and we have to keep those in mind as we look at potential links between climate change and human evolution, speciation, modern human evolution, including its behavior and the special characteristics and whatever that is that makes us modern. Okay? Obviously there is a context of climate change for all these, because we have now become very powerful in modifying the planet and changing its climate, and now the question is whether we are also smart enough to protect ourselves by reversing our effect or mitigating our effect, or making sure our actions are not harming the environment and other species, including ourselves. Okay, so we'll go to the next chapter in the next podcast.